13. We're looking at a lot of different passages today, and I want to make sure that you've got that word open on your lap so that we can track, so that we can follow through and follow along with what we're talking about. I want to point out to us today that the people that Jesus had the most trouble with in his ministry, the people that had the most trouble with Jesus, were the religious conservatives of his day. And that should make us sit up and take notice, because there's probably many of us in this room, myself included, who would say, but I'm a religious conservative today. Raise your hand if you think you might fall into that category. If you do, then like me, we have to take notice of this story, because it reminds us that there is a temptation always to become a Pharisee, and for the spirit of the Pharisee to take over our understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And what is a Pharisee? A Pharisee is a person who turns a critical eye towards other people, but is completely blind to what's going on inside here. That is the spirit of the Pharisee. They completely missed the heart of Jesus' mission and message, which was, in fact, to make the heart of God real and tangible for imperfect people, especially the outcast and the downcast and the sinner and the poor. Jesus' heart was to reach out and to bring everybody close. That's the heart of the Father, alive and working in the ministry of Jesus. Jesus is the King of the kingdom. Does anybody want to dispute that? So the way that Jesus designs the kingdom, that's pretty much up to him. And the way that he is designing the kingdom is to make it for us, for the poor, the lost, for people who have made life about everything but God. And the Pharisees didn't like that at all. They wanted to keep their boxes. And they wanted to see that people like Matthew and his friends remained outside the box. Jesus had a way of diffusing the frustrations of religious leaders. He pointed out something that should have been really clear to them. We'll put this up on the screen. If they understood the heart of God, this is it. It is not the healthy who need a what? But the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but the... Let's go over that again. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, it is the... I have not come to call the righteous, but the... Okay. It's worth some time spent on that sentence. Jesus is saying so much here. First of all, he steps inside the world of the Pharisee and meets them halfway. You see, they believed that they were the spiritual doctors. And they wanted to confront other people's sin with the medicine of God's law. But you see, they didn't know any better than that. They believed that they were serving God in this way. They believed that they were applying the law of God, which was holy. And so if people could just keep God's law, then they would be honoring God with their lives. And so this was the ministry of the Pharisees. But Jesus understood the irony behind what was going on for them. It was the Pharisees who were spiritually sick, having turned a relationship with God into a religion of ticking off the boxes, relating to the externals of life. Here's how Mark recorded Jesus' perspective on the teachers of the law a little bit later in his gospel. This is Mark 12, 38 through 40. Let's put this up on the screen. As he taught, Jesus said, "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplace and have the most important seat in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets." I will continue in a second. When I first became a pastor, I read this passage a little bit different. because back then, I wore flowing robes in a very liturgical, traditional church. And often, I was given the best seat to sit in, or I would sit up front in the church. And I started to read this and realize this text points at me. It's really important that I understand the message and the judgment that Jesus is bringing against those who might have the opportunity to think that they are better than others, or that they have a position that is better than others. So, those of you who are not pastors, you can read this however you want, but I remember reading this and going, whoa, I better pay attention. Continuing, they devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. I didn't happen to do any of those. My prayers were pretty short. These men will be punished most severely. Who deserves to be punished? Is it the sick and those that, the sinners, the people that the Pharisees were judging? No, it was the religious leaders of God. This is the religious leaders of God's people. This is radical stuff. This is what got Jesus crucified by the leaders of the day, who believed in their own self-righteousness. So there's a scary reality here. You can be very religious, but at the same time, very far from the kingdom of God and very far from God's heart. Why is that? Because sin hides so easily every place that we assume that we are right. Sin hides in the highest assumptions that we make of ourselves and the lowest observations that we make of others. God sees the darkness in all of this. Jesus' judgment of the Pharisees comes down really to one word: self-righteousness. And Paul preached on this just last week and did such a wonderful job of it. Righteousness comes from God, not from ourselves. It comes as a gift. To be right before God is a gift of grace. And that is the irony that we talked about before. Jesus came to call those who understood themselves to be sick and sinners. Those who believe that they are just fine will never come to Jesus. The only way to be part of God's kingdom is to come by grace and to receive it as a gift. Nobody can earn it for themselves. Nobody can set themselves up as the standard of the kingdom. And so that's the hidden meaning that Jesus gives here in this call, not to the righteous, but to the sinners. Those who see themselves as righteous will be offended by the true gospel and by those that Jesus chose to associate with. And so that's another thing that we need to spend some time on. The gospel changes who we associate with. And one of the great ironies of the Christian life is that the longer you live as a Christian in this world, the less non-Christian friends you tend to have. The farther we walk with Jesus, the less likely it is that we are associating with those who would offend the Pharisees. But the gospel is meant to push us outward. By including a tax collector among his disciples and by eating with Levi's friends, Jesus was demonstrating the power of the kingdom to change lives. You know who this guy is, Levi? Mark calls him Levi. You know who Matthew calls him in his gospel? Me. Levi is Matthew. Matthew wrote the first gospel that is recorded in our Bibles. Every church should be filled with people who have testimonies like this. So Jesus was breaking open the boxes that had been so neatly constructed by the teachers of the law. Well, the second story here that we looked at about fasting is another example of Jesus just not fitting into the religious boxes of the time. He was not fasting at a time when other people were fasting. The Pharisees, but also John the Baptist and his disciples. And people came to Jesus and said, "You're supposed to be fasting." Again, a box, right? Now, what fast is this? We don't know. We don't know. It could have been the fast associated with the Day of Atonement, which was required by the law. Or it could have been a fast the Pharisees had instituted on their own. They fasted twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, the Pharisees did. They were a skinny bunch. Have you tried not intermediate fasting? What is it called? Intermittent fasting. The Pharisees came up with that very idea of fasting intermittently. So what fast is this? We don't know, but Jesus wasn't participating in it. And that raised a lot of questions for people. And the way that he answers tells us a lot about the way that he understood his ministry. He answers with a parable about the bridegroom. Very simply, he says, if the bridegroom is here, it's not the time to fast. The Old Testament talked a lot about the bridegroom, but the bridegroom was always God. Here's a few passages we'll put up. Hosea 2:19. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. And here's Isaiah 62. As a young man marries a young woman, so will your builder marry you. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will your God rejoice over you. And the image of this marriage that God is proposing in the future, Old Testament future, was a redemptive marriage. It was a marriage that lifted up the bride from her position, even saving her from her circumstances because of the person that she was marrying. That's exactly what God promised he would do for you and for me and for the whole human race, anybody who will place their faith in Jesus Christ. We are participating in a redemptive marriage that lifts us up from the position that we were in and saves us from our circumstances. But Jesus is calling himself the bridegroom. Again, radical stuff. This is the stuff that got Jesus crucified by the religious conservatives of his day who did not understand what his mission and his ministry was all about. Because he was calling himself God on earth. Radical, outside the box. In fact, he's reorienting the practices of faithful Jews around himself by saying that he's not going to participate in this fast. And then he blows the doors open even more by talking about an unshrunk cloth and a patch and a wineskin. Let's put this up. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. The old covenant was going to be replaced by the new. But Jesus is saying we can't just patch up the holes in the old covenant. We have to begin with something radically different. The new will never harmonize with the old, he's saying. In these statements and in his positioning here, Jesus is putting himself more and more at odds with the religious leaders of his day and more in line with the grace and the mercy of God for sinners like you and me, for tax collectors, for outsiders. It's a redemptive wedding, a redemptive marriage. Always costs something, but Jesus is willing to pay the price. You see, you and I live in the reality of the new covenants and this redemptive marriage that Jesus has initiated with his death and his resurrection. We are not held to the burden of the law, which would only make us guilty and would have separated us from the bridegroom. Instead, we are held close by grace in this redemptive marriage that is offered to us. And in that marriage, our past sins, our past unworthiness is completely eclipsed by the love of the bridegroom for us. Our past sins, our past brokenness, all of those things are completely eclipsed by the brightness of the one who has called us his own by grace. Not our righteousness, but his. The challenge for us is to demonstrate the power of that grace that we have been receiving by making it available to those who don't already live in that. That is the mission of the church. That is what we are supposed to be doing. It's one of the reasons that we intentionally are a church in mission. We call ourselves a mission church because we always want to break the walls off the box. The box being right here. The Christian life is lived in mission outside of these walls, amongst the downcast, the outcast, the sinner, the tax collector of our day, but only with the knowledge that we are the very same. And because of the powerful grace that we have received, we are compelled. I love that word. We are compelled to share the love of Jesus with other people. It's messy. It's as messy as a dinner party at the home of a tax collector, but it is the work of God. It is what the kingdom requires of us. Would you stand with me? Lord, these are compelling things that we have talked about today. We know that we have the tendency to turn inward. We know that we quickly have the critical eye towards others and a remarkable blindness when it comes to our own lives. God, we pray that we would not participate in the spirit of the Pharisee, but instead, Lord, that we would participate in your spirit that blows the doors open, opens the windows, tears down the walls so that the people of this world may come to find the hope that is found in Jesus Christ.